Hi, this is Scott Anthony from Innosight. We are going to start today's webinar. The clock here in our Asia Pacific headquarters in Singapore shows 11:01 a.m. So good morning to those of you who are on the same time zone as us. Good afternoon and evening to those who are in different time zones. I'm joined in person with by my colleague Pontus Siren, who will be participating in today's webinar. He's one of the co-authors of the recent Harvard Business Review article that we had, Build an Innovation Engine in 90 Days. I'm also joined remotely, or we're joined remotely, from some colleagues in our U.S. headquarters in Lexington who are staying up late at night to help with today's webinar. Thanks to all of you for taking some time out of your day to listen to some of our thoughts here. We're going to try to make this as interactive as we can, try to share some of our thoughts and reflections on concepts in the article, but also engage in a dialogue with you. So we would really love for you to share questions that you have as we go through the webinar. Our team in Lexington will be collecting them and then feeding the best ones to us. We'll have hopefully a couple opportunities to pause and answer some of those questions. If we can't get to all of them, we'll send a summary afterwards with highlights from some of the best questions. But let's really try to make this as interactive as we can. For those of you who don't know who we are, just a little bit of background on Innosight. We are an organization united in a goal of helping leaders and clients that we serve to both see what's next and to be what's next, to create compelling growth strategies, to build capabilities to allow those strategies to stick, and to accelerate the new growth opportunities that really demonstrate a disruptive approach to growth. Founded by the internationally renowned thought leader Clayton Christensen, we've worked with clients all around the world to solve some of the mysteries of innovation and growth. Today, of course, we're really going to be focusing in on that middle part of our capability set. How do I, as a leader in an organization, build the capabilities required to make innovation repeatable and sustainable? And every time we look at this issue, we see further evidence that this is a real challenge. Here are three statistics from recent surveys done by different organizations, Accenture, Boston Consulting Group, and a survey that we did early last year. Almost everybody says long-term success is dependent on ability to innovate. Just about everyone believes that their organization needs not just to incrementally improve, but fundamentally transform over the next few years. And 3/4 of executives say innovation is a top priority for their company. This is clearly a problem that matters to people. And it clearly is something that people are struggling with. If you look at the statistics, you see only 1 in 5 executives believe their strategy is delivering a competitive advantage. Only about 1 in 3 are confident in their ability to transform. Even the ones that others perceive to be doing well are struggling with this. 40% of companies that are identified as top innovators by their peer consider their own capabilities to be average at best. These are the very best in the world that we perceive to be doing it well, and they will self-admit to struggling with making innovation a repeatable, sustainable discipline. Pontus, you want to explain a little bit about why we think this is such a big problem?
Sure. Good morning and good evening from me as well. Let me make 3 observations about some of the things we've seen on how companies, or how innovation happens in companies. First, every company innovates. Second, it actually happens in a very unplanned and unpredictable manner. And third, sometimes it's successful, but more often than not, these unplanned and unpredictable innovation efforts result in failure and frustration. A couple of quick examples. In one large company here in the Asia region, a success story, a single individual who, despite lacking structure and lacking formal support mechanisms, was able to push a project through to actually commercial fruition. But this required tremendous dedication and effort on part of this individual, and actually the project never got launched, or wouldn't have gotten launched, if it then hadn't been put into a more formal innovation system. Another example, and perhaps more representative of the failures of this kind of unpredictable innovation efforts, a large company closer to Europe, where the CEO said, I want new products and services, and I'll support you, go and do it. After 2 years, not a single commercially viable effort had been realized. So it's good to keep those 3 things in mind as we go through this webinar discussion. Every company innovates. It's often unplanned and unpredictable, and more often than not, it results in frustration and failure.
And just to build on what Pontus has said, what we then seek to do at Innosight, and what we try to expand on in the article, is to describe what you do in the face of this. Because certainly, in many cases, even when companies succeed, it's in spite of, not because of the company. The ones that succeed might represent the best things that the company could work on, or they might not. And what we're going to try to do as we go through the rest of the webinar is give you some tools to combat some of those problems. So as mentioned, we're going to try and make this interactive. Here's at least one point of interactivity. We asked you before the webinar to fill in a very short poll. And here's some of the results of the poll. The numbers in the top row, 0, 11, 45, 39, and 6, are from the general sample of people who filled in the survey we created after we wrote the article. It's a couple hundred people now. And the number in the bottom row represents the audience here. What you see here is very few people will report that their culture is highly friendly or highly supportive to innovation. The good news is the group here feels a little bit better about the degree to which their organization supports innovation compared to the broader sample. And we haven't found anyone yet who self-reports they're in a toxic culture for innovation and growth. So that's a good thing. In terms of some of the specific areas, we saw some strengths from people in this group. We saw willingness to take risks and a lack of fear of failure. We saw a clear view that innovation is a strategic capability and a willingness to kill bad ideas, which we think is absolutely critical, and we'll talk more about later. We saw some opportunity areas as well, something that we see all around the globe, short-term pressure crowding out space for longer-term thinking. We saw randomness in the selection and development of ideas, and we see good ideas being bogged down in the system. Now, this can lead to real problems inside organizations. Time and time again, we've seen circumstances like this, a little bit like that second circumstance that Pontus talked about, where a leadership team will identify the industry is changing, where the CEO and board will say, we've got to do something bold and dramatically different, and we're going to allocate resources behind it. When companies fail to respond to disruptive changes in the marketplace, it rarely is because leaders are blind. It rarely is because leaders don't allocate resources. They do this. Kodak spotted digital imaging. Nokia saw the smartphone revolution. You see this repeat again and again, but in case after case, well-intentioned efforts get swallowed up by what we call the shadow strategy of the organization. That is the day-to-day incremental decision-making mechanisms, the invisible pathways that exist within an organization that lead to you defaulting to doing what you have done before, even when you need to do something dramatically different. There are painful and punishing case studies of this, of really smart, really well-run companies that spot market inflections early, that make the necessary commitments, but still struggle. Because after all, your systems are designed to perpetuate today, not to create tomorrow. So let's hear a little bit from you about where you think there are challenges within your organization. Kristen, if you can open up the polling here, we've got a pretty simple question here where we'd like to get input from you about the biggest barrier to innovation within your business and business unit. If you were to pick one of the 5 here, which would you pick? Developing ideas, finding time and resources to develop those ideas, securing leadership support, commercializing and scaling ideas, and managing interfaces with and perhaps transitions to the core business. Cast your vote and tell us what you think. We'll wait just a minute here for some of the answers to come in, and then Kristen will open it up so we can see the results. All right, so we have something that is interesting. This is largely consistent with what we've seen in other places in that you get people who give a range of different answers. But what I see here, which is different from the last time we ran this webinar, is there is a preponderance of people, 52% of you, who say that finding time and resources to develop ideas is the biggest barrier within your organization. We'll get a chance to go a little bit deeper in this as we start talking, as we get through the webinar, about the mechanisms that exist to make sure that in a resource-starved environment, we can still push opportunities forward. So we'll make sure we hit on that in a couple different ways. So Kristen, if you can bring us back to the main presentation, that would be great. All right, so let's talk about what you do in the face of some of these challenges. One thing that we see many people do is they try to fight a system-level problem by doing a specific thing. That thing might be running a hackathon, a contest to get new ideas, forming a new growth group, having special purpose incentives to support new ideas, or something like this. This is a commercial that IBM ran a few years ago that's actually based on a real experience that we had in the field, where a company that was seeking to boost innovation hired a creativity consultant who suggested that the top leaders in the organization all dress up in spandex as superheroes and go and proclaim, "I'm innovation man or woman and it's innovation time." I think we all know that trying to fight system-level problems with point solutions simply doesn't work. We've got to do more than that. Another approach that we'll see in many places is a DNA transplant. You try to find people from whatever is the hot, innovative company of the day. This is a picture of Facebook's offices in New York, and put them inside your organization so they can spread that DNA through your organization. This can be a very good thing to do, but if this is the only thing you do, typically one of two things happen. One is the transplant rejects the host. You bring in the new person, they look around at the new environment, and they don't like it, so they leave. Even more punishingly, sometimes the transplant adapts to the host and begins looking like exactly what the organization was doing before. If all you do is bring in fresh talent, it's insufficient to solve the problem. The third thing that we've seen people do is to commit to approach the problem at a deep system-level way. So Procter & Gamble, as we noted in the article you see on your screen here, has spent years, if not decades, building what it calls the new growth factory that allows it to systematically and programmatically approach some of the challenges of innovation and growth. Procter & Gamble will be the first company in the world to tell you its efforts are far from perfect. It's got a lot of work that it still needs to do, but it's gotten a lot of dividends from these investments as well. These are really good things to do, but they take a really long time. So you're then left with a little bit of a quandary. If we're going to do a deep systematic level effort, that can take years and substantial investment. Doing a simple thing doesn't work. So what we tried to argue in the article is that there is a middle ground, something that we call the minimum viable innovation system, where we made the promise that within 90 days, with limited investment and no additional human resources, you could begin to approach innovation more systematically and more strategically. I'm going to turn the microphone over to Pontus. He's going to take us through the basic concept of the so-called MVIS and deep dive on the first couple of areas, and then we'll open up the mic and get some of your questions. Pontus?
Thanks, Scott. I think the first point to make and to reiterate again is that it is a system. And as Scott mentioned, you have to address system-level challenges with a system that tackles each one of them in turn. Very briefly, the overview. You need a clear definition of your innovation objectives and targets. And one of the upsides of defining those objectives is that it creates leadership alignment. Similarly, when the leadership aligns around strategic direction, where are we going to innovate? It sets the company in that direction, enables action to take place. Sufficient resources, perhaps one of the critical ones that Scott already mentioned and that the poll also highlighted. If companies are going to do innovation, they have to dedicate resources. Without the resources, there is no way to do this. And linked to that, the oversight that leadership provides is obviously critical. And what we've seen time and time again is that it's not leadership commitment that's the bottleneck. It's leadership time that's the bottleneck. But again, finding that time and those resources is critical for innovation efforts to succeed. Let me dive a little bit deeper into the first two of these definitions, and then I'll hand it over to Scott for the other two. So the first one is defining your innovation buckets. We like to keep this quite simple. There are many ways to define innovation, but ours is a simple one, something new that creates value. And there's a couple of ways to do this. One is to make the core business better, to improve the core. The second one, and the more challenging one, is to create tomorrow's business. And obviously, there's many ways to do this. Entering new markets, creating new business models, expanding into new geographies, etc. So there's many ways that companies can pursue the innovation challenge, but it's critical that there's a common language around innovation and that people understand where they're going to be focused. Let me give you a brief case study about Manila Water. This is a very successful public-private partnership that was established in 1997 to address the water catastrophe or water challenge, to put it more politely, in Metro Manila. Today, it's one of the most successful public-private partnership efforts in the utilities space. And like most of our customers and clients, it's a very, very successful company. They started with a situation in '97 when the water availability in the eastern zone of Metro Manila was really quite poor. And there were huge challenges in terms of access and quality of water. And Manila Water set out to address this challenge, and most recently, where we have the data from 2013, the water quality and the water availability in Metro Manila East Zone is really very, very good and meets international standards in many places. So a tremendous success story. But obviously the question for the company and the company's leadership was, what's next? This is a concession, so there were limits to growth within the East Zone. And while Manila Water has been successful in some other geographies like Hanoi, where they've done similar things in terms of improving the water quality, they were looking for more growth. The first thing that was done in this effort was really to define what were the innovation challenges and how much growth the company was really looking for from these efforts. So the first question was, how much growth does innovation or innovation efforts need to address? And Manila Water set a very ambitious target. Obviously, innovation and new growth wasn't the only way the company was thinking about increasing their top and bottom line, but it did play a very significant role in their planning. There was obviously also core optimization and other more traditional efforts, but new growth and innovation was certainly very important for this company. And they were also very specific in terms of how they were going to achieve these targets. Optimization was going to account for a certain chunk of that growth gap. Sustaining and expanding into other geographies was going to address another portion of the growth gap. And finally, creating new business models was also targeted for a substantial chunk of the growth gap. And the company was very clear and spent a decent chunk of time really understanding and aligning the leadership around where they were going to focus and where growth was going to come from. And if you set very ambitious growth targets for innovation and new growth, there are implications in terms of then building a robust system to help you achieve those goals. The next question that companies need to tackle is obviously where to focus. There are so many things companies could potentially do today in terms of expanding and creating new business models that it becomes a real challenge to align and focus on the right types of opportunity areas. And I guess you could say that there are two philosophies around how to pursue new growth efforts. One is represented by this gentleman, Chairman Mao, who in the mid-50s had a campaign of letting 100 flowers bloom. And essentially it was the effort of saying many, many ideas, and actually in his case critique of the regime and improvement ideas, And to make a very long story short, that was very quickly shut down, and those 100 flowers wilted or worse. The other gentleman here on the right is John F. Kennedy, who famously spoke about choosing to go to the moon, selecting a very strategic, a very ambitious program and a very ambitious goal, and then dedicating resources to achieve that goal. We would suggest that the approach embodied by Kennedy's moonshot is a more robust and effective way to think about innovation and new growth efforts. If we think about how to identify those strategic opportunity areas, we're looking for areas where there is an underlying market need, an underlying trend such as technology, regulatory change, or other, and unique company capabilities or assets that can be leveraged. So we have to ask questions and answer, obviously, questions such as, what problem are we going to be solving? And whose problem are we going to solve? So having a deep understanding of the customer and the problem they face. How might we be uniquely positioned to solve this problem, and what kind of underlying assets or capabilities might we bring to the table? Technological changes, new business models, etc. And also, when we look at these three questions comprehensively, why are we uniquely positioned to win? And one has to be careful with the right to win or uniquely positioned to win, in that we don't just replicate what we're already doing today, where most companies are very good, but we stretch in the right manner. So we don't just replicate, but also we don't jump into something that's completely unrelated or completely new. Just a few words on the practicalities of doing this. How do you go about doing and uncovering these opportunities? Let me reflect again on the Manila water case. The first one, the first task, the first activity is really immersion. Immerse yourself in those areas in the lives of those customers that seem to be a good fit on the strategic opportunity area map. And this is really the raw material of innovation. You have to spend enough time in the market with the customers in immersions. And without that raw material, it becomes very difficult to do the heavy lifting of innovation later on. This is a picture of yours truly and some of the folks from Manila Water visiting some of the low-income families in Metro Manila and really trying to develop an understanding of some of the challenges that they face in their day-to-day life. Of course, you don't want to reinvent the wheel. So prudent management always takes a look at what's going on in the world more broadly, and if there are opportunities or if there are solutions that have already been developed elsewhere, sometimes it might make sense to see if those can be applied in a different market. So obviously a global scan of what's going on is necessary as well. In terms of ideating, it's important first to diverge. So if you think about light hitting a prism, it splits into hundreds of different directions, and that's very important in the ideation phase, that the team and also the management has the liberty to think expansively. But sooner rather than later, and in the article we suggest a period no more than a month or so, there needs to be a convergence of the thinking. Where are we really going to concentrate our efforts? And then more like a laser beam, focus the efforts of the team and of the management on those areas. Now, it doesn't mean that all those areas which have been selected are going to automatically be great winners, but without that focus, it's impossible to discover the real potential of an opportunity. And just to close off with the Manila Water example, again, two areas which we looked at. One was commercial wastewater. Here you see a picture of some deep-fried food being prepared. And as you know, or you may know, in Manila, there are many fast food outlets, and they produce a lot of waste products, a lot of them liquid, etc. And there's environmental impacts around those. So thinking about solutions around industrial wastewater was certainly an opportunity. Another opportunity was considered was advertising. Manila Water sends out millions of bills every month, and there was a possibility to think about actually building a business around advertising in conjunction with the billing. The company chose to focus on the industrial wastewater, which is a much bigger opportunity in many ways, but again, just shows that the company and the team considered a broad range of opportunities before it selected to focus on a couple of strategic opportunity areas. Scott?
Excellent. Well, I mentioned in the beginning that we want to hear your voice during this discussion, so we are going to pause here and get some questions. So we've got a few questions that have already come in from folks. We'll try to take a couple or three here, and then we'll hopefully have another break for questions after I go through the next two parts of the MVIS. So I've got a question that I'll read out here, and Pontus, I'll provide maybe my first thoughts, and you can build on top of it. Can structured innovation inhibit disruptive innovation? To structure, move innovation more towards process optimization? The answer that I would give very clearly is no. The proper structure does not inhibit disruptive innovation. I think going back to the key elements of the minimum viable innovation system, the first thing, defining your innovation buckets, is making very clear if your organization is hoping to drive disruptive innovation, that this is one of your strategic choices. You might have some process innovation efforts. You might have some disruptive innovation efforts. Making clear in the beginning that these are distinct and different efforts that you will manage and measure in different ways helps a huge amount. And then disruptive innovation has been, of course, incredibly well studied by our co-founder Clayton Christensen, augmented by many of the other things that we've written. We really do see that you can follow a structured and disciplined approach to pick up the theories and tools of disruptive innovation and do it more programmatically and systematically. So we absolutely do not think that structured innovation inhibits disruption at all. Pontus, I wondered if you could add some thoughts there too.
Yeah, just an observation. Thanks for the good question. I think it highlights the fact that companies and leadership teams especially need to have a very clear common language around innovation. And if you have that common language around innovation, it's very easy to say some of our efforts are around process optimization, and that's well and good and often very necessary. Then if you've got disruptive threats and people really understand what those are and what disruption actually means, then companies can take the appropriate action and build the appropriate system to respond to those threats. But again, having that common understanding and that common language is the first step in addressing these challenges.
And of course, there is a very famous story in the disruption literature that illustrates what Pontus has spoken about. Andy Grove famously has Clayton Christensen come out about 2 years ago now and give lectures around the theory of disruptive innovation. And from those lectures and those discussions, ultimately the low-end Celeron processor is born and expedited. And when asked to reflect on it, Grove said, Christensen never told me what the answer was. What he did was give me and my leadership team a common language and a common way to frame the challenge so we as a group could come up with consensus around what otherwise would have been a counterintuitive course of action for us. So that common language is incredibly important for all of this. I've got another question that's been zinged to us from Lexington. I'll take this one and maybe we can get one more in, Kathy, and then we will go on to the next part of the presentation. The question I see here is, I see the need for a minimum viable system, but how do I convince a skeptical senior leadership team to invest in one? I think that the first thing, and again, I'll start on this and give you time to think about other brilliant things to say as always. So I think the first thing that I would say here is to really stress the word minimum. You're not asking when you ask this to be created for huge investments. You're not asking for huge headcount. You're not asking for a huge amount of time to demonstrate that this is going to work. Instead, you're asking for the bare necessities, for the least that you can possibly ask for. So I think the more that you stress that this is a basic building block that creates option value, I think the easier it is to get people to get on board behind it. I think the second thing that I'll say, and then I'll flip it over to Pontus, I think if you get people to understand at a deeper level the pace and scale of change taking place in the marketplace today, I think it gets them to understand that a more systematic approach to innovation is almost always required. Now, you can do this by telling the horror stories of companies that went from market leaders to afterthoughts in the blink of an eye. Nokia is a painful example for my Finnish friends here, where in 2007 it was the unassailable market leader. In 2013 it sells off its cell phone business. You always can use examples closer to home in your own industry, but you really highlight to people the critical importance in investments in innovation and growth. So those are at least a couple things that I would recommend. Pontus, what else would you add?
A couple of thoughts in the same line. One of the key values or attributes for people who want to engage in innovation efforts is really candor. Being able to have very open and frank discussions about both the opportunities and challenges around innovation. And there's no doubt that innovation is challenging. It is a difficult discipline. But the discussion that companies and leadership teams need to have is, what's the alternative? What's the alternative if we do nothing? If we don't tackle these difficult challenges, if we don't build some of the capabilities and some of the systems that Scott mentioned, which are not massive, but are rather quite focused and targeted, what happens if we don't build those capabilities and systems? What's the alternative? And in an increasingly large number of industries, the alternative is quite dire, or at least it represents a future which may not be that attractive. So having that discussion and trying to highlight some of the opportunities, and as Scott mentioned, perhaps sometimes also some of the challenges that will inevitably encounter companies, is perhaps one way to try to address that question.
All right, very good. Well, thank you, Pontus. We've got a few other questions that I see have come in. I think we're going to save those for the next question break, just so we can make sure that we lay out the basics of the MBIS, and then again, we'll get to some of the other questions here. And if you have other questions, keep them coming in. We'll do our best to answer as many of them as we can in the time we have allotted together. So as Pontus mentioned, I'm going to take the mic and the clicker for the next two areas here, where I talk about the importance first of forming a small dedicated team for innovation, and then how senior leaders need to shepherd some of the new innovative ideas through some of the challenges that you necessarily will face in the early stages of innovation. First, forming a small dedicated team. The key message here is you need to have at least somebody, and probably a few somebodies, that are fully dedicated to the cause of pursuing the creation of new businesses. Without that, it is almost impossible to succeed. Now, of course, we know in the innovation literature there are stories to the contrary. There are iconic stories from companies like 3M, where Post-it notes and other inventions came from the so-called 15% rule, the 15% of time that engineers can dabble and think about different projects. Or Google, who has followed historically a very similar rule that has allowed it to create Gmail and a range of other solutions. Those rules work in very particular contexts like 3M and Google that have a lot of systems around them. Many organizations look at these stories and say, this is easy for us to solve. All we need to have is Free Thinking Friday, Wacky Idea Wednesday, or if you're a hard-charging organization, Special Purpose Saturday. But the truth is, in most organizations, if you don't have someone dedicated to innovation, your odds of successfully commercializing an idea are very close to zero. Now, I like to use a metaphor to illustrate this point, which is not the greatest metaphor in the world. I recognize it has its challenges, but it serves an illustrative point as well. On the screen here, hopefully you've got pictures of breakfast that involves two animals. The chicken participated in the breakfast. The pig is fully committed to the breakfast. If you are trying to win in a fiercely competitive world with a bunch of innovation chickens that are running around, loosely committed to the cause, your chances of success in our experience are approximately zero. You need to have at least one pig, hopefully one that does not die during the process, that's waking up every morning and going to sleep every night obsessing about the idea they're working on. Remember, most startup businesses fail. This is with the full-time dedication of a committed leadership team. If you're trying to beat these odds with a bunch of part-timers, it is an incredibly steep challenge. Now, this is the part of the presentation or the discussion where we usually get people saying, whoa, 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 whoa. You promised me that I could do this within 90 days. You promised me that I didn't have to bring in new resources. But I've got two basic challenges. The red box on the left side of the page, we're running flat out. We don't have the capacity to do this. Or the blue box on the right side of the page. Yeah, we might have some people around that we can allocate to this, but they haven't worked at Google, Facebook, Virgin, whatever. They don't have the skills to actually do this. So how do you go and do this? If you say things in the left side of the box, the thing that we urge you to do is to go and find a particular type of project that we are confident exists within your organization. This is what we call a zombie project, the walking undead, that if you are honest about it, will not really address your growth challenge. But still, it lingers and shuffles along, typically because in most organizations, nobody likes to come clean and admit that they're working on an effort that's not going to have meaningful impact. In almost every circumstance we've seen, if you can find the zombies and humanely put them down, all of a sudden you have a lot more resources for innovation than you thought. Now, there is a little bit of science for how you actually go and do this. Rita McGrath, by day, is a professor at Columbia University. By night, she is a certified zombie killer who offers the best advice out there on how you can artfully and delicately put down zombie projects in your organization. There are 6 pieces of advice that we extract out of McGrath's work. The first is to make sure before you go on a hunt for zombies, you predetermine the criteria by which you're going to make decisions, to make it as unemotional as possible. Involve people who are not involved in the idea's conception. I think each of my 3 children are the most beautiful children in the world. Of course, I'm a father. That's what you're going to think. The person who conceives of an idea can see all of its beauty. The outsiders can tell you the baby's actually pretty ugly. Not mine, of course, other people's babies. Third thing, every time you innovate, 2 good things can happen. Either you succeed commercially or you learn something useful that sets you up for future success. Codify that reusable learning. Fourth, celebrate the success. You've learned something, you've created more learning and more resources for further efforts. This is something that should be celebrated loudly and communicated widely. We, in fact, call the procedure we've described here in the article a zombie amnesty, where you let people come clean and say, this is a great moment where we can celebrate as an organization that we're willing to shut some things down, we extract the learning out of it, we celebrate and communicate widely, and finally, we make sure that everyone is clear that this project is done. We provide closure with some kind of symbolic event. My colleague here, Pontus, has told me this great story of a Finnish gaming company that any time a new game is launched successfully, the development team gets toasted with beer. Every time a new game is shut down, the development team is toasted with champagne. It makes clear to the organization that they're willing to take risks and also that this effort is done. And Supercell, the company behind Clash of Clans and other games, has been very successful because they continue to demonstrate a willingness to go and push the envelope. So if you think you don't have capacity, go and hunt out the zombies. We're sure they're there. If you think your people don't have the capabilities, get ready to start reading. Innovation has been studied now for decades. These are some of our favorite books. These are all highlighted in our article. And as you read through books like these, some of which we wrote, many of which we didn't, you begin to see a common pattern and a common checklist that allows anyone who follows that pattern and checklist to be at the very least a competent innovator. Of course, mastery in any field comes from practice, routines, and discipline, but anyone, we believe, who follows this kind of checklist can increase their odds of success. Now, I'm not going to go through all of the 11 points on the checklist here. What I wanted to do to end this section was to provide the 2 key insights that we think are most critical and illustrate an organization that followed this approach and came up with what we think is a pretty cool idea. If you simplify everything on the checklist, it suggests you ought to listen to 2 critical voices. The first is the great management thinker Peter Drucker. Peter Drucker once said, the purpose of a business is to create a customer. And he also said, the customer rarely buys what the company thinks it is selling. Companies think they're selling products, they think they're providing services, but that's not what customers think about. They've got a problem they're trying to solve, or in Innosight language, a job they're trying to get done. If you follow Drucker's guidance, you seek out the job not done well. You try to understand the customers very deeply and tease out, even if they can't adequately articulate it or put words around it, what are the problems they're seeking to solve. You then come up with ideas to solve the problem. You turn to your second innovation muse here. This is the great American actor, philosopher, and occasional boxer Mike Tyson, who once said, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. The truth about innovation is that every idea, and I mean every idea, is partially right and partially wrong. Great innovators recognize this. They have hypotheses, they go on and run experiments in the market, they extract learning, and they move on. An example of an organization that followed these approaches and came up with an interesting idea is the Settlement Music School. This is a not-for-profit organization located in the Philadelphia area in the United States that does music education. Historically, their music classes were targeted to children. When Helen Eden took over as executive director a few years ago, she had a mandate for the organization. Let's expand beyond children to adults so we can utilize the 6 centers that we have more effectively and more efficiently, turning them into third places like houses of worship or even Starbucks cafes. So the team followed the guidance of the 2 people here. They went into the market and talked to a whole bunch of people. They kept hearing recurring themes from adults. They wanted to recapture their youth. They wanted to find new friends. Music was something that allowed them to bring these 2 things together, but there was nothing that allowed them to solve this problem. They began to come up with an idea. It ultimately got called Adult Rock Band. You see a picture of it hopefully on your screen here. The idea was you get a group of people together under the tutelage of an expert instructor, and you let them jam together, ultimately forming a band. Now, like any idea, it's just an idea, so Settlement went and very carefully tested it at one of their centers. It turned out that there were some portions of the idea that worked, that they accelerated, other things that didn't work so well that they tweaked, and some things they learned that suggested it wasn't going to work at every single one of their centers. From this and other efforts, Settlement has been able to really dramatically improve and increase the programming they have for adults and earn a prestigious grant from the Pew Charitable Trust to continue to invest in these programs. Now, Settlement didn't make any big outside hires. We worked with them over just a couple-day period to train them in the basics of innovation, and then their own staff went into the market to do the things described here. Anyone can do this with the right approach and attention. The final area that I'll spend just a few minutes talking about, then we'll open it up for questions and provide a couple wrap-up thoughts and send you on your way, is creating a mechanism to shepherd projects. This is really important inside any organization of scale. The systems and structures and processes and rules within your organization are designed to optimize today's business. When you're innovating, particularly when you're going to create something new, do disruptive growth, whatever you want to call it, you need to come up with different mechanisms that allow you to nurture those ideas through their fragile early stage. Let me start this time with an example of an organization that created this kind of shepherding mechanism, then spend just a couple minutes talking about what is critical behind it. The thing that you see pictured here is the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto, one of the most prestigious pediatric institutions in the world. Then CEO Mary Jo Haddad a few years ago said, as innovative as our organization is in the therapies we provide to children, we have to be just as innovative in how we provide patient care and how we organize things inside our hospital. One of the things that Haddad and team did was create an 18-person group called the Innovation Working Group. This was a group of senior leaders in the organization that committed to spend at least a portion of their time shepherding innovation efforts in the organization. This group did 3 critical things. First, they had an amount of funding. If someone within the organization came up with an idea, they could submit it to the group. The group could agree to give them funding and lift them out of their day job to push the idea forward. Secondly, they provided training and coaching, helping people follow some of the items on the checklist we just talked about. Third, they evangelized innovation in the organization. They celebrated it. They talked it up every chance they could get to demonstrate that this was critical to sick kids. By having this and other approaches, what the Toronto Hospital for Sick Children is hoping to do is to inspire more ideas like the Pain Squad, a really interesting, innovative idea. One of the big problems you have when you're trying to treat young children is getting them to admit or tell you how much pain they're facing. Imagine how painstaking this is, no pun intended, when you've got a young leukemia victim who's 7 years old trying to get out of them how much pain they're currently encountering. It's critical for proper therapies, however, because it allows you to change doses of medicine and so on. A nurse within Sick Kids had a very clever idea. What if we gamify the problem, come up with something that might be an app on a smartphone where kids play the game and without realizing it, admit how much pain they're facing. It turns out through clinical trials this actually works. It dramatically increases the accuracy of pain reporting and has been a big win for Sick Kids. The Innovation Working Group and other mechanisms that help to shepherd ideas allow this type of innovation to happen inside an organization. What's critical to do here is to recognize when you set up this kind of shepherding mechanism, it is going to follow a disciplined approach. But it's going to be a very different set of disciplines than the ones that you use to optimize today's business. We're all pretty familiar with these forms of disciplines. Annual budgets where groups come together and get consensus around it, a numerical exercise where deviations get punished, where all the work is largely done in conference rooms. These are actually very good and important disciplines when you're trying to run today's business as effectively and efficiently as you can. But when you're trying to discover tomorrow's businesses, we suggest that you borrow disciplines used by venture capitalists. What do venture capitalists do? They stage investments in innovations tied to reductions in risk. They don't expect every decision is going to have full consensus by a group. In fact, many venture capitalists will tell you the best investments that they make are those that are polarizing. They look at numbers, of course, but they care even more about the team that's telling them the numbers and the story they're telling. They know there are going to be twists and turns on the path to success, and they're out in the market, living, working alongside the teams, touching the raw data so they can make informed decisions about businesses that no one has ever seen before. Make no mistake, this is a very disciplined approach to innovation, but it's a different set of disciplines that's critical as part of your minimum viable innovation system. Now this means you need a very particular type of leader inside your organization. The academic literature talks a lot about so-called ambidextrous leaders that can use both their left brain and right brain equally. What I think you really need are leaders that are chameleon leaders, that can change the entire way that they operate. They can be optimizers when they need to. They can be discoverers when they need to. This changes the way that you do many things. Let me end this section, and then we will get a chance to get some more questions after we provide just a couple things to summarize what we've talked about thus far by talking about one fundamental thing that a chameleon leader has to do differently. That is, use different approaches to measure progress in different types of situations. As a metaphor, think about how you identify whether someone is good at the 3 games that appear on your screen here. How do you identify a good roulette player? If you're struggling to answer the question, it's because it's a trick question. There is no such thing as a skilled roulette player. It is a game of pure chance. If anyone is playing this game inside your organization, you ought to punish them because they're taking not well thought out risks. At the other extreme, think about the game of chess. How do you know whether someone's good at chess? It's actually pretty easy. You don't have to watch them play. All you have to do is look at the results they achieve. Do they win? What's their ELO rating? What's their won-loss record, etc.? Chess is a game of almost pure skill. You know with certainty that if I'm playing against my 9-year-old son, Charlie, for the next couple of years at least, I'm going to win that game. Just like you know if I play against Kasparov, I'm going to lose that game. When you're evaluating people playing these games inside your organization, this is when you reward the results they achieve. This is what it's like in your core business. Think about blackjack or poker or investing in a stock or hitting a baseball. This is something that blends together a little bit of luck and a little bit of skill. Anytime you do it once, the answer can be something that is random. But over long periods of time, those that follow the right approach, those that follow the right patterns, those that have the right skill will win. But if you're looking to evaluate someone if they're playing the game once, you're not rewarding the results they achieve. You're looking at the process that they're following and the learning that they get. A chameleon leader recognizes the different circumstances they face and is willing to think differently about how they measure and manage their people. So there it is, the minimum viable innovation system. Just to wrap up, if you're seeking to do this inside your organization, to drive the new and different inside your organization, remember these 4 things. Define innovation clearly, direct it strategically, resource it intensively, and nurture it carefully to overcome the shadow strategy that will pull you back to doing what you already were doing in the past. Remember, this is a system. You do not pick and choose between these 4 elements. Do it all or do nothing. If there is one area that's more important than any other, it is the 3rd one. Because after all, strategy isn't what you say you do, it's what you actually do. As we wrote in the article, if you have no one fully dedicated to new growth, you have made the strategic decision to not focus on new growth. People will spend a lot of time worrying about incentives. In our mind, the bigger challenge is how you treat failure, less around how you reward success. And this really does require active, consistent leadership, particularly whenever you're touching the core business. The interfaces with and transitions to the core can be absolutely killer. Now, we've got about 8 minutes left before we run out of time here. What we want to do now is get another chance to get maybe 2 or 3 questions. Then Pontus will show you one last slide that talks about what you do beyond the minimum viable innovation system, and we will call it a webinar. So, Kathy, send us some other great questions we've got from the group. I see a good one here already. I can see how you would set an agenda for innovation and come up with ideas in 90 days. But is that realistically achievable in 90 days? What is the real outcome in 90 days? I'll say a couple things here, and then, of course, we'll add Pontus to add on. I think the thing you want to get people to recognize is Rome wasn't built in a day. You're not going to go and create $1 billion business at the end of 90 days. But what you can commit to is by the end of 90 days, you will have identified the problem you're trying to solve. You'll have picked a couple strategic opportunity areas. You'll have people who are making meaningful progress against those areas, and you have a mechanism in place to continue to guide and shape those ideas as they move forward. You should expect by the end of 90 days that you will have started working on ideas. At the very least, you've got some hypotheses about what a sustainable, successful strategy will be, and you've begun to identify the biggest risks or uncertainty in those strategies, which means within the next 90 days, you're starting to go out and run experiments to learn more about some of those key uncertainties. Pontus, what else would you add here? What's realistic in a 90-day time frame?
It's a great question, and of course 90 days sounds like a very short period of time, but when I think back at some of the efforts we've been involved with, in 90 days we've been really able to see that the team has been set up and the team is up and running. And these are not huge teams, these are between 3 and 5 people, but the team has been allocated, it's up and running, so to say. Then there's the leadership side. In 90 days, you'll have the leadership team already working with these efforts, and there's a certain, in the good cases, there's really a cadence that's already set in. The leadership team meets, the team prepares, does their work, reports to the leadership, who gives them guidance, etc. So you can actually have the system already functioning. Now, of course, you won't answer all the questions around what opportunities or efforts are the best ones, or how we're going to execute a specific market entry in any great detail. But the system can be up and running. Then the heavy lifting is, of course, going deeper into all the market-facing questions and challenges that these teams deal with. But really, in terms of an outcome in the 90 days, is a system that's up and running.
All right, fantastic. Well, we've gotten, I was going to take one more, but we've gotten 2 more good questions. So, Pontus, I'll suggest we'll take those 2 more questions. We'll have one concluding thought. We might run about 3 minutes over for those of you listening, but I promise no more than that. Just so everybody knows, this is being recorded, and we'll let you all know when it's available on the website. So those who have to drop off and want to hear the cherry on top at the very end of the webinar, you'll be able to do that afterwards. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about the first question, first of the last 2 questions we got here. Will this be more focused on innovation within the core? Will this mean you can expect more incremental than disruptive innovation? Pontus, you want to take the first crack at this, and I'll add in anything else?
Sure. So if you're building a minimum viable system, it will really be focused more around non-core innovation. The core innovation or core improvement optimization is really work that should be already ongoing and that should have resources dedicated to it. Companies often deploy systems like Six Sigma and others to address the core optimization or core innovation efforts. So the minimum viable system is really designed to help companies address new growth and new innovation challenges.
And just the one thing I would add on is ultimately how far you go and how much you push into whatever you want to call it, white space, blue ocean, disruptive transformational space, is a strategic choice. And it depends a lot on what your growth goal is. So in the case of Manila Water, with the goal of trying to double net income within a 5-year period, they have to push the frontier because they simply cannot get there by doing an even better job of running today's business. They know that. In other contexts, you've got a lot of room for growth within today's business and business model, so you might actually keep something that looks a little bit more like adjacent rather than really pushing the frontier of innovation. But it is a strategic choice that you can use the system to do many different things for. The final question, which I thought was an interesting one, how relevant is the system to startups? Is the system a description of what startups live by? I would say my own sense is a lot of these things, frankly, are not relevant to startups because these are designed to help counteract the systems that ultimately get put in place for large businesses to run. The third area where we talk about how you stand up a team and the practices that team should follow, I think are good general innovation practices that should be used by everyone. Pontus, I don't know if you would add anything to it or have a different perspective.
No, I think that's right. Startups have different challenges and different structures. The minimum viable system is really designed for larger corporate settings.
All right, but you did see Settlement Music School is not a particularly large organization, and Manila Water, while bigger than Settlement, is not huge either. We've seen this deployed in massive companies. We have an example from Citi in the organization, the global financial company. We've seen it employed in reasonably small companies. And even at Innosight, our 80-person company here, we use a lot of the elements as well. So Pontus is going to give us the last content slide, and then I will give us our very last slide. Pontus, how do you go beyond the MVIS?
So a couple of observations. I won't go into all the details in the interest of time, but obviously there is a lot more detailing that can be done in terms of what the growth targets are and really creating a more detailed master plan in terms of how those targets will be achieved. So that's clearly something that can be done as the system is developed and detailed further. Then, of course, there's the question of what are really the strategic opportunity areas and developing a better capability to really monitor and understand the changes that are affecting the industry that companies are working in. And, of course, having a portfolio of ideas, having an idea supply chain is something that companies will sooner rather than later want to develop to make sure that the innovation team has raw material to work with going forward as well. There's, of course, a lot of work that can be done around detailing the innovation process in terms of what actually gets done and making sure that that process is as robust and the skills and capabilities of the team are adequate to address those challenges as they move forward in tackling the innovation task. And finally, the portfolio and tracking system is not an insignificant challenge. How you measure innovation teams, how you track the efforts, what's considered, how you make the decisions around continuing an effort or terminating an effort, and making those more robust and detailed is something that companies think about once the minimum viable system is up and running. So those are some of the broad challenges that companies tackle once they've set up the minimum viable system and it's been operational for some time.
And I think to repeat a theme that we said at the very beginning, this is a starting point to a destination. It is called minimum viable for a reason. It isn't something that will solve all innovation problems. It doesn't give you a fully functional growth factory overnight, but it certainly hopefully sets you on the way to untangle those invisible innovation pathways and allow you to more predictably, more reliably innovate. Well, the clock here in Singapore shows 12:01. We have reached the end of the webinar here. We thank you very much for taking the time out of your day to participate with us. We got a bunch of good questions. We didn't get to answer all of them, so if we didn't get yours, we apologize. Please feel free to contact us directly. You see our email addresses hopefully on the screen now. You see my Twitter handle as well. We really are committed to the cause of innovating with impact and helping people all around the world more predictably and more reliably do the things that we know they are capable of doing. And we hope some of the thoughts that we've shared today help you in your journey. So on behalf of Pontus and Kathy and Kristen and Raj and the whole team behind this, I, Scott Anthony, wanted to say thank you very much and have a great day.